Korean War began suddenly on June 25, 1950. At least that's the version recorded in history books. Those history books, however, gave little or no reason for the invasion. Most versions of the story paint North Korea as war-crazy communists, and that's why they attacked. But what if there's more to that story? What happened during those 5 years between the end of World War II and the start of the Korean War? Peeling back the layers of history, the seeds of the Korean War can be seen planted during the Japanese occupation, an occupation that began in 1910. The Japanese used a divide-and-conquer technique to suppress Korean independence movements, which worked in the following way. Korean independence fighters identified in many different ways. Some appreciated capitalism, some were communist, some only cared about independence. Japan divided them from colonial society by labeling all of them as communist. That way they could manipulate Koreans into believing that Japan was protecting them from the so-called foreign evil of communism. Japan also employed Koreans in their colonial structure, in the military, the government, and especially the national police. Those Korean forces used the most brutal techniques in suppression of political dissent. When World War II ended, Koreans all over the peninsula organized local committees. They tried to create their own authority in the Korean People's Republic on September 6, 1945, keeping the peninsula united in spite of the U.S.-Soviet decision to divide it into 2 zones on August 15th. Their priorities were Korean autonomy from all foreign governments, removing Koreans from their land and power who collaborated with Japan, and organizing their own government with democratic participation. Extreme right-wing Koreans who collaborated with Japan realized they were so unpopular they feared losing their power and their wealth. They convinced the U.S. military government to suppress democratic participation so that only they would have access to resources and government administration. When the U.S. military government occupied the southern region, they were swayed by pro-Japanese Koreans and their own anti-communism. They continued the Japanese divide-and-conquer strategy. They labeled all Korean local governments and organizations connected to the Korean People's Republic as communist, whether they were left-wing or moderate right-wing, and despite their democratic popularity. They exclusively allied with and employed extreme right-wing Koreans who had worked with Japan in the southern government and administration. The South Korean military was placed under the direction of Koreans who fought for Japan in World War II against the United States and against the Korean independence movement. Especially concerning to the local people was that the U.S. re-employed all of the Koreans who served Japan in their feared colonial police force. The U.S. Colonel William Maglin, in charge of the Southern National Police, said, "We figured those Koreans did a good job for Japan, then they would do a good job for us." These ill-advised policies manifested in riots all over the southern U.S. zone, beginning in autumn of 1946. They exploded most dramatically on Jeju Island, when the U.S. and Korean National Police arrested all the popular local leaders and blocked them from running for office. In response, the entire island rose up to boycott the undemocratic and separate elections that were endorsed by the United Nations in 1948. The U.S. and the brand-new South Korean government responded with a campaign of massacres, now known as the Jeju April 3rd incident. The South Korean and U.S. governments continued to claim that the uprising was directed by Soviet and Northern officers, despite lack of evidence, as all prisoners and casualties were Jeju locals. By the end of 1949, the U.S. and South Korea government had caused 15,000 casualties in Jeju alone. By the time June 1950 came around, Korean independence fighters in North Korea were watching all of this unfold. North Korean forces, incensed that the U.S. and Southern government made up of Japanese collaborators, decided they could wait no longer, and invaded on June 25, 1950. The Korean War and all current North Korean policy might be better understood as responses to conditions that the U.S. helped to enshrine in the South Korean system. That system continued through military dictatorships in South Korea until 1987, and vestiges remain in current South Korean society as virtually all political opposition to the status quo receives the label of communist or pro-North even today. The system has been perpetually backed up with military threats of North Korean annihilation. Martin Luther King once wrote that it would be morally irresponsible for me to condemn riots without at the same time condemning the contingent and tolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions. Does this conflict persist because the U.S. has helped to perpetuate intolerable conditions in Korea? Will more hostility convince North Korea to stop fighting for the right of self-determination? Or is there another way to come to terms with the mistakes of our past, dismantle systems of oppression, and build trust for a future of peace? The National Council of Churches in Korea, along with the World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA, believe that signing a peace treaty to end the state of war would be a way to open up possibilities for reconciliation. You can join our campaign now at www.koreapeacetreaty.com.